The woman behind the welfare desk froze when she saw the name on page 4. The woman behind the government desk had reviewed more than 10,000 applications in 22 years. But when she reached the 4th page of Rachel Monroe's file, her fingers stopped moving. On that page was a name from 11 years earlier, the name of the young lawyer who had once saved her daughter. Now that same lawyer sat across from her with $6 in her purse, her late mother's Bible beneath her arm, and a hungry 6-year-old girl asleep against her shoulder. For several long seconds, neither woman spoke. Outside, a January wind pressed against the tall windows of the Philadelphia Assistance Center. Fluorescent lights hummed above rows of gray plastic chairs. Somewhere near the entrance, a tired child was crying. A printer coughed out page after page of forms, each one reducing a human life to boxes, numbers, signatures, and dates. Rachel Monroe sat perfectly still. She was 37 years old, though the last 8 months had placed shadows beneath her eyes that made her look older. Her wool coat had once been black, but years of winter rain had softened it into charcoal gray. One button was missing. The lining had torn near the left pocket. She had sewn it closed with blue thread, because blue was all she could find in the sewing kit at the family shelter. Her daughter, Grace, slept with her cheek pressed against Rachel's arm. The little girl wore a red knit hat that had belonged to Rachel when she was a child. It was too large and kept sliding over one eyebrow. Her small hand was closed around a yellow crayon. In Rachel's purse were $6, 2 bus tokens, 3 overdue notices, a copy of her law degree from Columbia University, and the funeral program from her mother's service. Those were the pieces of her former life. Once, Rachel had occupied a corner office on the 23rd floor of a glass building overlooking the Schuylkill River. Her name had been printed in gold letters on the door. Rachel Monroe, Senior Counsel. She had worn tailored suits, carried leather briefcases, and billed clients $400 an hour. She had argued before family court judges who knew her by name. She had been quoted in legal journals and invited to speak at conferences about economic control within marriages. She understood how one person could slowly take away another person's independence without ever raising a hand. She understood hidden accounts, false debts, restricted access to money, property transferred quietly into trusts, credit cards opened without permission. She had explained those patterns to juries, judges, frightened wives, and young attorneys. She simply had not recognized them inside her own home. That was the part she could barely forgive. Rachel had been raised in West Philadelphia by her mother, Evelyn Monroe, a public school librarian with patient eyes and a voice made for reading stories aloud. Rachel's father, Samuel, died in a traffic accident when she was 9, leaving Evelyn to raise her alone. There had never been much money, but there had always been books. Evelyn believed a home with books could never be truly poor. Each night, after making soup and helping with homework, she repeated the same sentence. "Knowledge may not stop the storm, baby, but it will teach you how to build again." Rachel carried those words through scholarships, college, and Columbia Law School. On graduation day, Evelyn stood before anyone else and applauded with both hands above her head. After the ceremony, she gave Rachel a small leather Bible. Inside the cover, she had written, "When the world tells you who you are, listen politely, then remember who raised you." Rachel kept that Bible through every promotion, every move, every victory, and every mistake, including the mistake named Jonathan Hale. Jonathan entered her life at a charity dinner supporting neighborhood literacy programs. He was 42, the chief financial officer of a regional hospital network, polished, patient, and generous in all the ways people could see. That evening, he donated $50,000 for books in underfunded schools. Rachel thought of her mother and mistook public generosity for private character. Jonathan pursued her carefully. He remembered her colleagues' names, brought soup when she was sick, and installed a railing when Evelyn's arthritis made the front steps difficult. Evelyn liked him, and that mattered deeply to Rachel. They married 18 months later in a stone church near Rittenhouse Square. Jonathan promised she would never have to carry life alone again. For the first year, he seemed to keep that promise. When Rachel became pregnant, he attended every appointment and painted the nursery himself. Grace was born during a spring thunderstorm, and Rachel believed she had built the family she had always wanted. Then the changes began. They did not arrive as commands. They arrived as favors. Jonathan offered to manage the household accounts because Rachel was returning to work and already had too much responsibility. He suggested consolidating their investments so they could save on fees. He encouraged Rachel to place her salary into a joint account, explaining that separate accounts made a marriage feel like a business arrangement. At first, Rachel resisted. Then Grace became ill with recurring respiratory infections. There were specialists, late-night fevers, missed workdays, and weeks when Rachel slept in 2-hour stretches. Jonathan stepped in. He paid the bills. He organized the insurance documents. He handled the mortgage. Whenever Rachel asked about money, he kissed her forehead and told her everything was under control. She mistook relief for safety. 3 years passed. Rachel reduced her hours at the firm because Grace needed frequent medical care. Jonathan praised her for choosing motherhood. He told friends that Rachel was the most devoted woman he had ever known. Behind closed doors, he began questioning every purchase. Why had groceries cost more that week? Why had she bought Grace new shoes when the old pair still fit? Why had Rachel given her mother $200 for a home repair? He never shouted. He only asked questions until Rachel felt foolish for spending money she had earned. Then he suggested she take a formal leave from the firm. "Just 1 year," he said. "Grace needs stability. Your mother needs help. I make more than enough for all of us." Rachel hesitated. Her career had been built over 15 years. But Grace was 4, Evelyn's health was declining, and Jonathan made the choice sound temporary. 1 year became 2. During those 2 years, Jonathan moved with extraordinary care. He changed passwords. He transferred funds. He opened credit accounts under Rachel's name. He refinanced the house and placed the new documents among hundreds of other papers, knowing she was exhausted when she signed them. He intercepted mail from the State Bar Association and allowed Rachel's professional license to become administratively inactive after fees and continuing education requirements went unpaid. When she asked why she could no longer access their savings account, he blamed a bank security update. When a credit card company called about a balance she did not recognize, he told her it was an error and promised to handle it. When Evelyn warned Rachel that Jonathan had become too controlling, Rachel defended him. "He is carrying this family," she said. Evelyn looked at her daughter for a long time. "Sometimes," she replied quietly, "a person carries you so you will forget how to walk." Rachel was offended. They did not speak for 4 days. It was the longest silence they had ever shared. Rachel would remember those 4 days for the rest of her life. The truth began with a hospital bill. Grace needed a minor procedure. At the registration desk, Rachel handed over her insurance card. The clerk typed for several moments, then frowned. The policy had been canceled. Rachel called Jonathan. He did not answer. She paid the deposit with a credit card. The card was declined. She tried another. Declined. A third. Declined. Grace stood beside her in a paper hospital gown, holding a stuffed rabbit and watching her mother's face. Rachel borrowed money from Evelyn. That evening, after Grace was asleep, Rachel opened Jonathan's office computer. She knew the password because it was the date they had first met. The irony would come to her later. At the time, she was too frightened to appreciate it. She found spreadsheets, dozens of them, account transfers, loans, credit lines, property records. 3 years of careful financial movement. Jonathan had shifted nearly all their liquid assets into a holding company controlled by his brother. He had borrowed against the house. He had opened 5 accounts using Rachel's Social Security number. He had allowed her health coverage to lapse while continuing his own. There was more. He had written emails describing Rachel as emotionally unstable. He had documented private disagreements as though preparing evidence. He had taken photographs of unopened mail and cluttered rooms during the weeks when Grace was sick. He had created a record of disorder, not because Rachel was incapable, but because he intended one day to make her appear that way. Rachel sat in the dark office until nearly dawn. The computer screen illuminated her hands. They were shaking. Not because she did not understand what she was seeing, because she understood it completely. She had reviewed the same pattern in case files. She had questioned witnesses about the same methods. She had warned other women that control rarely begins with a locked door. Sometimes it begins with one person saying, "Let me take care of everything." At 6 in the morning, Jonathan entered the office wearing a white dress shirt and carrying a cup of coffee. He saw the spreadsheets on the screen. He did not look surprised. Rachel stood. "How long?" she asked. Jonathan placed the coffee on the desk. "You should not have gone through my files." "Our files." "That is exactly the kind of confusion I have been trying to prevent." Rachel stared at him. He spoke calmly, almost gently. He said she had been out of the workforce too long to understand their finances. He said she had become anxious and impulsive. He said the accounts were structured to protect the family. Then he said something that ended the marriage. "If you leave, Rachel, you leave with what you brought into this house." She looked toward the hallway where Grace was sleeping. "And my daughter?" Jonathan's expression did not change. "That will be decided by people who examine evidence." In that moment, Rachel understood the purpose of the emails, the photographs, the unpaid professional fees, the damaged credit, and the carefully recorded disagreements. He had not merely taken her money. He had prepared to take her credibility. Rachel waited until Jonathan left for work. Then she packed 2 bags, placed Evelyn's Bible in her purse, and drove Grace to her mother's row house. Evelyn opened the door before Rachel reached the steps. She looked at the suitcases, then at Grace, then at her daughter's face. She did not say, "I warned you." She simply opened her arms. For 12 days, the old house became a refuge. Evelyn made chicken soup. Grace slept in Rachel's childhood bedroom beneath glow-in-the-dark stars that still clung to the ceiling. Rachel sat at the kitchen table surrounded by legal pads, bank records, and old case files she could still access. Rachel called former colleagues and attorneys across the city. Some cited conflicts because Jonathan's hospital network touched their firms. Others listened sympathetically but required retainers she could not afford. People she had once mentored offered kind words, then stepped back. Jonathan's connections reached through hospitals, banks, charities, and professional boards. Rachel had believed a respected career created a community. Now she learned how quickly a community could become an audience watching from a safe distance. On the 13th morning, Evelyn collapsed in the kitchen. She had been standing at the stove making oatmeal for Grace. The spoon fell first, then Evelyn. Rachel called emergency services and knelt beside her mother, speaking her name over and over. At the hospital, doctors discovered that Evelyn had suffered a severe stroke. Her condition had likely been developing for months, hidden behind headaches and fatigue she had dismissed as age. Evelyn never fully regained speech. For 4 days, Rachel sat beside her hospital bed. Jonathan called twice. Not to ask about Evelyn, to demand that Grace be returned home. He told Rachel that removing a child from the marital residence without agreement could be used against her. Rachel listened in silence. Her mother lay beside her, breathing through a clear tube. Grace colored pictures in the waiting room. On the 5th evening, snow began to fall over Philadelphia. Large, quiet flakes drifted past the hospital window. Rachel held Evelyn's hand and read aloud from the Book of Psalms because it was the only thing she could think to do. Near midnight, Evelyn opened her eyes. For a moment, they were clear. She looked at Rachel. Her lips moved. No sound came. Rachel leaned closer. Evelyn tried again. "Walk," she whispered. It was the last word she ever spoke. She died before dawn. Rachel's grief had no room to arrive properly. There was a funeral to arrange, a child to comfort, a court notice waiting at the house. Jonathan had filed for temporary custody, claiming Rachel had removed Grace without cause, had no income, had an inactive law license, and was living in an unstable environment. 3 days after burying her mother, Rachel stood in family court wearing a black dress borrowed from a cousin. She represented herself. She presented bank statements and copies of the financial records. Jonathan's attorneys argued that the documents had been obtained without authorization and required verification. The judge did not dismiss Rachel's concerns, but the hearing was brief and crowded. Temporary shared custody was ordered. Grace would remain primarily with Rachel for the moment, but Jonathan received scheduled visits. Rachel left the courtroom feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath her. Outside, Jonathan approached her near the elevator. He kept his voice low. "You cannot outlast me," he said. Rachel looked at him. She had slept less than 10 hours that week. Her mother had been buried 72 hours earlier. Her bank account held $83. Still, something inside her refused to bend. "I do not have to outlast you," she replied. "I only have to tell the truth longer than you can hide it." Jonathan smiled. It was not a kind smile. The weeks that followed stripped Rachel's life down to its frame. Evelyn's house carried more debt than Rachel had known, and without income she could not keep the payments current. Creditors called daily. Her car was repossessed from the curb, while Grace watched from the window. Rachel sold furniture, jewelry, and finally the pale blue dress Evelyn had worn to her law school graduation. It brought $40. $32 went to groceries. $8 went to bus fare. She applied for legal, compliance, administrative, teaching, and entry-level jobs. Her inactive license frightened some employers. The gap in her resume discouraged others. Her damaged credit closed doors she had never known, depended on credit. One interviewer called her overqualified. Another worried she would leave once her circumstances improved. Rachel wanted to ask how life was supposed to improve if no one would hire her until it already had. Instead, she thanked them and walked back to the bus stop. By March, the bank began foreclosure proceedings on Evelyn's house. Rachel packed her mother's books into cardboard boxes. She kept only 12. The Bible, a worn dictionary, 3 children's books Evelyn had read to Grace, a collection of poems, and 7 novels with handwritten notes in the margins. The rest went to the neighborhood library. On the final night in the house, Grace slept on a blanket in the empty living room. The furniture was gone. The walls showed pale rectangles where family photographs had hung. Rachel sat on the floor and listened to the old pipes. She remembered her father's laughter, her mother humming in the kitchen, her own footsteps running down the hallway when she was 9 years old. A house could hold a life long after the people had left it. That night, Rachel pressed her palm against the floorboards and apologized to her mother for losing the home. Grace stirred beneath the blanket. "Mama, I'm here. Is Grandma's house going to another family?" Rachel swallowed. "Yes, sweetheart." Grace considered this. "Will they know she was here?" Rachel looked around the empty room. "I think houses remember." Grace nodded sleepily. "Then it will tell them." The next morning, Rachel locked the front door for the last time. She and Grace moved into a family shelter near North Broad Street. The shelter was clean but crowded. 20 families shared kitchens, bathrooms, and a narrow recreation room painted a cheerful yellow that could not hide anyone's exhaustion. Grace called it the Yellow House, and Rachel let her. At school, Grace explained that their old house was helping another family now. Rachel heard this from the counselor, held herself together until she reached the bathroom, then cried silently inside a stall. Poverty, she discovered, was not one great humiliation. It was 1,000 small negotiations with dignity, counting coins beneath grocery store lights, washing a blouse in a sink before an interview, refusing coffee because bus fare cost more, and telling your child you were not hungry. For months, Rachel avoided applying for food assistance. She had helped clients complete the forms before. She knew the program existed for families in crisis. She knew needing help was not a moral failure. Knowledge did not erase shame. Every time she considered going, she heard Jonathan's voice. No income, no home, no active license, no stability. She imagined those facts typed into a court document. She imagined him saying that a woman receiving assistance could not provide for a child. Then one evening, Grace opened the small shelter refrigerator and stared at the half carton of milk inside. "Mama, can I have cereal?" "There isn't any cereal left. Can we get some tomorrow?" Rachel looked at the $6 in her purse. She had a court filing due that week, and needed $4 for transportation to the legal aid office. "We'll see," she said. Grace closed the refrigerator. "That means no." She did not say it angrily. That made it worse. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed. Grace climbed beside her. "I'm sorry," Rachel whispered. The child frowned. "For what?" "For things being hard." Grace leaned against her mother. "Grandma said hard things are not forever." Rachel closed her eyes. Her mother's voice seemed to move through the room. "Knowledge may not stop the storm, baby, but it will teach you how to build again." The next morning, Rachel placed Evelyn's Bible beneath her arm, took Grace's hand, and rode 2 buses to the Philadelphia Assistance Center. The building stood between a pharmacy and a discount clothing store. Its stone entrance had been worn smooth by decades of people walking through in difficult seasons. Inside, the air smelled of wet coats, floor cleaner, and old coffee. Rachel took a number. 212. The digital display showed 174. She found 2 seats near the wall. Grace pulled crayons from a plastic bag, while Rachel completed the application. Name: Rachel Denise Monroe. Household members: 2. Current address: the shelter. Employment status: unemployed. Available cash: $6. Assets: none. Professional qualifications: Juris Doctor, Columbia Law School. Former senior counsel, Barrett, Cole, and Whitman. State law license administratively inactive. The final question asked for the reason behind her hardship. The form allowed 3 lines. Rachel stared at the space. How could 3 lines contain a marriage, a betrayal, a dead mother, a lost home, a frightened child, and 8 months of closed doors? She wrote, marital financial misconduct, employment interruption, housing loss, and pending family court proceedings. The words looked clean and orderly. Her life had not been either. Grace held up her drawing. It showed 3 women standing beneath a large tree. One was tall, one was small. The third had wings. "Who is that?" Rachel asked, though she knew. "Grandma. Why does she have wings?" "She needs them to get back." Rachel looked away before Grace saw her face. 3 hours later, their number was called. Rachel gathered the forms, the Bible, the crayons, and her sleeping daughter. They approached desk 7. The caseworker seated there was a 62-year-old woman named Mrs. Eleanor Brooks. Eleanor had silver hair cut close around her face and brown eyes that seemed tired without being cold. She wore a burgundy sweater and a small gold cross around her neck. For 22 years, she had sat behind some version of that desk. She had watched factories close, marriages end, illnesses begin, rents rise, and savings disappear. She had learned that hardship did not have one face. It arrived wearing work boots, nursing uniforms, business suits, military jackets, fast food aprons, church dresses. Sometimes it arrived with a college degree folded inside a purse. Eleanor greeted Rachel, offered Grace a cup of water, and began reviewing the application. Page 1. Identification. Page 2. Household information. Page 3. Employment and income. Then page 4. Professional history and legal circumstances. Eleanor's finger moved down the lines. Columbia Law School. Barrett, Cole, and Whitman. Family Law Division. Her finger stopped. She read Rachel's name again. Then she looked up. The professional distance left her face. Rachel Monroe? Rachel straightened. Yes. Eleanor removed her glasses. Did you work for the Family Justice Project before joining Barrett and Cole? Rachel had not heard that name in years. The Family Justice Project had been a small legal clinic where she volunteered during the first years of her career. Yes, she answered slowly. I did. Do you remember a woman named Vanessa Brooks? The room seemed to narrow. Rachel searched her memory. Thousands of clients. Hundreds of frightened faces. Then one emerged. A young woman with a green coat. A little boy who refused to let go of her hand. A husband who controlled her wages and threatened to leave her with manufactured debt. Rachel remembered nights spent tracing transfers through 6 accounts. She remembered discovering that the husband had forged Vanessa's signature on a business loan. She remembered the final hearing, Vanessa crying in the courthouse hallway because the judge had restored access to her income and granted temporary custody protections. Rachel looked at Eleanor. "Vanessa was your daughter?" Eleanor's eyes filled. "She is my daughter." Grace woke and lifted her head from Rachel's shoulder. Eleanor continued. 11 years ago, Vanessa believed she was going to lose her son. Her husband had taken every dollar she earned. He had placed debts in her name. He told everyone she was irresponsible. She had no money for a lawyer. Rachel remembered. The case had lasted 5 months. The clinic had nearly declined it because of limited resources. Rachel had taken it anyway. She had been 26, newly licensed, and stubborn enough to believe sleep was optional. "You stayed after work every night," Eleanor said. "You drove to our apartment on Sundays because Vanessa was afraid to travel alone. You found the forged documents. You found the hidden account." Rachel lowered her eyes. "I was doing my job." "No." Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. "You were doing more than your job." She reached into the drawer beside her desk and removed an old photograph protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. In it, a younger Eleanor stood beside Vanessa, and a small boy outside the courthouse. Vanessa was smiling through tears. Rachel was visible at the edge of the photograph, holding a folder and looking away from the camera. Eleanor placed the photograph on the desk. "My grandson is 16 now," she said. "He plays trumpet in his school band. Vanessa became a respiratory therapist. She bought a little house in Germantown 2 years ago." Rachel touched the edge of the photograph. She made it. She did, because someone believed her before she remembered how to believe in herself. Eleanor looked at the application again, then at the worn coat, the sleeping child, the $6 written beneath available cash, the Bible beneath Rachel's arm. "What happened to you?" Rachel had answered that question many times with dates, balances, documents, and carefully arranged facts, but under the tired fluorescent lights, facts deserted her. "My mother died," she said, and her voice broke. Eleanor waited. Then Rachel told her everything. Jonathan's control, the missing money, the inactive license, the custody case, Evelyn's stroke and funeral, the lost house, the shelter, and Grace asking for cereal. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When Rachel finished, she stared down at her hands. "I should have known," Rachel whispered. "I taught other women to recognize this." Eleanor leaned forward. "Knowing the map does not mean you cannot get lost." Rachel looked up. "My daughter said the same thing for years. She was ashamed because she worked at a hospital and still did not understand what was happening in her own marriage. But control changes the way you see. It makes the unreasonable feel normal, one small step at a time." Eleanor placed both hands on the application. "You are not less intelligent because someone betrayed your trust." Rachel pressed her lips together. For months she had needed to hear those words. She had not known it until they were spoken. Eleanor began working. The food assistance application qualified for expedited review. She checked the required boxes, attached proof from the shelter, and contacted a supervisor. Then she did something that changed the direction of Rachel's life. Eleanor opened a small binder filled with numbers gathered over 22 years. Housing programs, school advocates, transportation grants, legal organizations, and people who answered because she had never wasted their time. Her first call secured an interview for a small transitional apartment with a private kitchen and bathroom. The second reached David Palmer, a legal services attorney known for taking complicated financial misconduct cases. He agreed to review Rachel's documents. The third call went to a bar association program that helped attorneys restore licenses lost during family or financial crises. If Rachel's records supported her account, reinstatement might take weeks rather than months. The fourth call arranged transportation so Grace could remain at the same school. 48 minutes. 4 calls. 4 doors. Rachel sat with one hand covering her mouth. When Eleanor placed the phone down, Rachel asked, "Why are you doing all this?" Eleanor glanced at the old courthouse photograph. "Because 11 years ago, you stayed late for my daughter. I did not do it so anyone would owe me. I know. Then you do not owe me. Eleanor smiled. This is not debt, Ms. Monroe. This is what kindness becomes when it lives long enough. Grace had returned to drawing. When Eleanor placed the phone down, Rachel said, "Why are you doing all this?" Eleanor glanced at the old courthouse photograph. "Because 11 years ago you stayed late for my daughter. I did not do it so anyone would owe me." "I know. Then you do not owe me." Eleanor smiled. "This is not debt, Miss Monroe. This is what kindness becomes when it lives long enough." Rachel looked at the application. For the first time, the form did not appear to be evidence of failure. It looked like a bridge. The transitional apartment was on the 3rd floor of an aging brick building near Mount Airy. The stairs creaked. The kitchen floor leaned slightly toward the window. The radiator knocked at night like an impatient visitor. To Rachel, it was beautiful. There was a deadbolt on the door, a small bedroom for Grace, a second-hand table beneath the window, 2 blue mugs in the cabinet. Grace ran from room to room, opening drawers and inspecting closets. "Which one is mine?" Rachel pointed toward the smaller bedroom. Grace stepped inside. Sunlight fell across the wooden floor. The room contained one narrow bed, a lamp, and a bookshelf with nothing on it. Grace turned slowly. "I get a whole room?" "A whole room. Can Grandma find us here?" Rachel looked toward the window. "Yes," she said. "I think she already has." That night, they ate grilled cheese sandwiches at the small table. Grace placed her drawing of the 3 women beneath the tree on the refrigerator. Rachel used a piece of tape to secure it. One tall figure. One small figure. One with wings. The next morning, Rachel met David Palmer. David was 58, broad-shouldered, soft-spoken, and known for wearing old suits with excellent shoes. He had spent 30 years in public interest law. His office contained more files than furniture. Rachel gave him 3 boxes of documents. He opened the first, then the second. By the third, his calm expression had changed. "You organized all of this?" "I began the night I discovered the accounts." David studied the timeline. "You understand that you may be my most qualified client. My license is inactive. That is a paperwork condition. Your mind is not inactive." He found evidence Rachel had overlooked. Jonathan's holding company had received transfers from 2 previous joint accounts connected to his first marriage. A former wife had signed a settlement under sealed terms. David obtained permission to contact her. Her name was Margaret Hale. She was 61 and living in Delaware. At first, Margaret refused to speak. Then David explained that another woman and a child were facing the same pattern. Margaret agreed to meet Rachel in a quiet diner outside Wilmington. She arrived early. Her hair was white. Her hands trembled when she lifted her coffee. "I was married to Jonathan for 9 years, Margaret said. He was not wealthy then. He was building his career. She described the same progression. Shared accounts, changed passwords, false debts, claims of emotional instability, a carefully prepared divorce. Margaret had lost nearly everything. Jonathan had convinced the court that the financial confusion resulted from her poor management. She had accepted a small settlement because she could no longer afford representation. After the divorce, Margaret said, I spent 10 years believing I had been foolish. Rachel looked at her across the table. You were not foolish. Margaret gave a sad smile. Neither were you. She brought records. Old statements, letters, copies of loan documents. The signature patterns matched. The holding companies were different, but the registered agent was the same. Jonathan's brother. David filed an emergency motion for financial discovery. Jonathan's attorneys responded aggressively. They argued that Margaret's case was irrelevant. They questioned the legality of Rachel's access to certain files. They portrayed Rachel as a bitter spouse using her legal training to create suspicion. But this time, Rachel was not alone. Her food assistance was approved. The apartment provided stability. Grace remained in school. Her license reinstatement began moving forward. David stood beside her in court. Eleanor called every Friday. Sometimes she asked about the case. More often, she asked whether Rachel had eaten. 6 weeks later, Rachel's law license was restored. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope. Rachel opened it at the kitchen table. She read the sentence twice, then a third time. Grace watched from across the room. "Is it good?" Rachel laughed and cried at once. "Yes." "Are you a lawyer again?" Rachel knelt and held her daughter. "I never stopped being one." She returned to work slowly. David's organization could not afford another full-time attorney, but he offered Rachel temporary contract work. The pay was modest. The cases were difficult. The office copier jammed every afternoon. Rachel had never felt more grateful for a desk. Her first client was a grandmother named Miss Pauline who was fighting an unlawful rent increase. The second was a nursing assistant whose former partner had opened utility accounts under her name. The third was a widower threatened by a fraudulent home repair contract. Rachel listened differently now. Before, she had focused first on facts. Now she noticed hands, whether they trembled, whether clients avoided eye contact, whether they apologized for taking her time. She began every meeting with the same sentence: "You do not have to prove your dignity before I help you." The work restored something no court order could return: purpose. Meanwhile, discovery in Rachel's case exposed years of financial manipulation. Jonathan had transferred more than $300,000 from marital accounts. He had borrowed against the house without fully disclosing the terms. He had allowed Rachel's license to lapse intentionally, forwarding some notices to a private mailbox. He had compiled personal records in anticipation of a custody dispute long before Rachel discovered the accounts. Most damaging was an email to his brother. "She will have no money, no current license, and no fixed residence. By the time she understands what happened, the court will see instability." Jonathan's attorneys tried to explain the message as frustration. The judge did not appear persuaded. At the custody hearing, Rachel sat beside David. She wore a navy suit donated through a professional clothing program. The sleeves were slightly long. The shoes pinched her toes. Jonathan sat across the aisle in a tailored gray suit. For years, his composure had frightened her. Now she saw it differently. Calm was not proof of truth. Sometimes it was simply practice. The child advocate submitted a report. Grace was thriving in Rachel's care. Her school attendance was strong. She was attached to her mother and felt safe in the transitional apartment. During the interview, Grace had said something that appeared in the report. "My mama gets scared sometimes, but she always tells the truth." Rachel read that sentence before the hearing. It gave her more courage than any legal argument. The judge ordered that Grace remain primarily with Rachel while the financial case continued. Jonathan retained visitation, but the court rejected his request to portray Rachel's temporary use of assistance and transitional housing as evidence of unfitness. Public assistance during a documented crisis, the judge said, is not proof of parental failure. It may be proof of responsible action. Rachel closed her eyes. For months, shame had spoken in Jonathan's voice. Now the court had answered it. The financial hearing took place in early autumn. By then, leaves had begun turning gold along the streets near City Hall. Rachel had been living in the transitional apartment for 7 months. Grace had lost 2 front teeth. Eleanor's grandson had begun sending Grace recordings of trumpet songs. Margaret had agreed to testify. The courtroom was not grand. There were no dramatic balconies, no polished speeches delivered beneath perfect lighting. There were folders, screens, spreadsheets, bank statements, dates, signatures. The quiet architecture of control. David presented the evidence patiently. He showed how Jonathan moved assets, how he created debt, how he isolated Rachel from information, how he allowed her professional license to lapse, how he built a false record of instability. Margaret testified about her marriage. Her voice shook at first, then grew stronger. Jonathan's lead attorney suggested that she was still resentful after many years. Margaret looked directly at him. "I am not here because I resent the past," she said. "I am here because I recognize it happening again," Rachel testified last. David asked her to describe her career before leaving work. Then Grace's illness, Evelyn's declining health, Jonathan's offer to manage the finances, the inaccessible accounts, the debts, the email, her mother's death, the shelter, the assistant's office. At one point, Rachel's voice faltered. She looked toward the public seats. Eleanor sat in the second row. Beside her was Vanessa, the woman Rachel had helped 11 years earlier. Vanessa pressed one hand to her heart. Rachel continued. Jonathan's attorney approached for cross-examination. He asked whether Rachel possessed a law degree. Yes. Whether she specialized in family financial cases. Yes. Whether she understood the importance of reviewing documents before signing them. Yes. Then would you agree, Ms. Monroe, that someone with your education should have understood the financial arrangements within her own marriage? The courtroom became very quiet. It was the question Rachel had asked herself every night. The question shame had repeated. The question that had nearly destroyed her. Rachel looked toward the judge. Then toward Jonathan. Finally, she faced the attorney. Education can teach a person how misconduct works, she said. It cannot guarantee that someone they love will never deceive them. The attorney shifted. Rachel continued. I understood the pattern when I saw all the pieces together. What I did not understand was that my husband was creating those pieces one at a time while telling me he was protecting our family. You signed documents. Yes. You allowed him to manage accounts. Yes. You left your employment voluntarily. I left after he encouraged me to care for our sick child and my aging mother. But you agreed. I trusted my husband. The attorney paused. Rachel's voice remained steady. Trust is not legal permission to commit fraud. No one moved. The judge wrote something on the legal pad before her. The ruling came 3 weeks later. Jonathan was ordered to return the marital funds transferred without Rachel's informed consent. Debts created under her name were referred for correction and further investigation. The court awarded Rachel a share of the remaining property and ordered reimbursement of certain legal costs. The email evidence, prior pattern, and questionable loan documents were referred to the appropriate authorities for review. The ruling did not restore Evelyn's house. It did not return the months Grace had spent in a shelter. It did not allow Rachel to hear her mother's voice again. Justice rarely returns everything. Sometimes it simply stops the taking. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited because the case had attracted attention within the legal community. Rachel did not speak to them. She walked past the microphones and found Eleanor near the steps. Vanessa stood beside her. For a moment, the three women looked at one another. Past, present, future. Vanessa stepped forward first. You saved me, she said. Rachel shook her head. You saved yourself. Vanessa smiled through tears. That sounds like something my mother would say. Eleanor reached for both women's hands. Maybe saving is the wrong word, she said. Maybe we keep reminding one another where the door is. Grace came running down the courthouse steps holding David's hand. Mama, did we win? Rachel knelt. We told the truth. Grace considered the answer. Did they hear it? Yes. Then we won. 1 year after Rachel first entered the assistance center, she and Grace moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near Chestnut Hill. It was not large. The kitchen cabinets were old. The bathroom door stuck during humid weather. The living room windows faced an alley where a man played jazz records every Sunday morning. Rachel loved it. Her name was the only adult name on the lease. The first object she placed in the apartment was Evelyn's Bible. The second was Grace's drawing of the 3 women beneath the tree. Rachel found a wooden frame at a thrift store and hung the picture near the front door. Grace entered 2nd grade. She joined the school choir, even though she often sang half a note behind everyone else. Rachel attended every performance. When Grace searched the audience, her mother was always there. David's organization offered Rachel a permanent position, leading a new financial justice unit. The salary was less than half of what she had once earned. She accepted before he finished explaining the benefits. Rachel began training attorneys, caseworkers, librarians, nurses, and church volunteers to recognize signs of financial control. She spoke not only about hidden accounts and false debts, but also about shame. Shame isolates people before poverty does, she told them. A person may know help exists and still believe the door was built for someone else. Once a month, Rachel held a free clinic at the same assistance center where Eleanor worked. She sat at a folding table beneath the fluorescent lights. People arrived carrying envelopes, notices, account statements, and fear. Rachel reviewed each case carefully. She never rushed the person telling the story. Sometimes there was a legal solution. Sometimes there was only a referral, a phone call, or a clear explanation. Rachel had learned that hope did not always arrive as a miracle. Sometimes it arrived as accurate information written on a yellow piece of paper. 2 years later, Eleanor retired. The assistance center held a small gathering in the break room. There was sheet cake, coffee, and a banner printed on office paper. Vanessa came. Her son played a trumpet version of Amazing Grace. Grace stood beside him and sang. Rachel watched Eleanor wipe tears from her face. After the music ended, Eleanor handed Rachel a small box. Inside was the old courthouse photograph, the one showing Eleanor, Vanessa, her grandson, and Rachel at the edge of the frame. "I think this belongs to you now," Eleanor said. Rachel touched the plastic sleeve. "This belongs to your family." Eleanor shook her head. "You are part of the story." Rachel looked at the younger version of herself. At 26, she had believed helping Vanessa was one case among many. She had not known a thread was being tied around that moment. She had not known it would stretch across 11 years. Through a marriage, a child, a betrayal, a funeral, a shelter, a government office. She had not known the thread would hold when everything else broke. "Do you remember what you told me that day?" Rachel asked. Eleanor smiled. "That kindness becomes something else when it lives long enough?" Rachel nodded. "What does it become?" Eleanor looked toward Vanessa, then toward Grace. "Family, sometimes." That evening, Rachel and Grace rode home through the city. Rain moved softly across the bus windows. Grace rested her head against Rachel's shoulder. "Are you sad Grandma Evelyn did not see our new life?" Archie asked. Rachel thought before answering. "I am sad she is not here." "That is not the same thing." "No," Rachel said. "It isn't." Grace looked out at the lights passing in the rain. "I think she knows." "What makes you think that?" "Because houses remember." "You said so." Rachel smiled. "I did say that. And people remember. And pictures remember. Maybe love remembers too." Rachel looked at her daughter. 6 years old when they entered the assistance center. 8 years old now. Older, taller, still carrying the wisdom of someone who had crossed a difficult season without allowing it to harden her. Rachel kissed the top of her head. "Yes," she whispered. "Love remembers." Years later, Rachel was invited to speak to young lawyers entering public service. Grace sat in the front row beside Eleanor and Vanessa. Rachel placed Evelyn's Bible on the podium and spoke without notes. "I once believed education would keep hardship away," she said. "It did not stop betrayal. It did not keep my mother alive, save our house, or feed my daughter when I had $6. The room grew still. But knowledge helped me recognize the truth. It helped me organize evidence and rebuild my career. More importantly, hardship taught me that no one survives by knowledge alone. We survive because someone answers the phone, explains the form, opens a door, or remembers a kindness we have forgotten." She looked across the graduates. "Your degree is not proof that you are above the people who need help. It is proof that you have been given tools. What matters is where you carry them." Afterward, a frightened young graduate confessed that everyone else seemed more prepared. Rachel opened Evelyn's Bible and showed her the words inside. "When the world tells you who you are, listen politely. Then remember who raised you." The young woman read them twice. "My mother says something like that." "Mothers often do," Rachel replied. Rachel returned home that night. The apartment was quiet. Grace, now a teenager, was studying at the kitchen table. The refrigerator hummed. Jazz drifted faintly from the neighbor's window. Rachel stood near the front door and looked at the framed picture. 3 figures beneath a tree. One tall, one small, one with wings. There had been a time when Rachel believed losing Evelyn's house meant losing the life inside it. She understood differently now. A home was not only walls. A legacy was not only money. A mother's voice could survive inside a sentence, and a kind act could survive for 11 years, waiting for the day it was needed again. Rachel had entered the assistance center, believing $6 measured how little remained. She believed the shelter address proved failure, the inactive license erased her career, and asking for help made Jonathan's accusations true. She had been wrong. The $6 did not measure her worth. The shelter did not define her motherhood. The form did not erase her education. Asking for help meant she was still walking. Evelyn's final word had never promised an easy road. Walk when the house is gone. Walk when grief sits beside you. Walk when shame tells you to hide. Walk through the government doors, toward the desk, across the courtroom, and into the life that remains. Jonathan had believed that if he took Rachel's money, license, home, and reputation, nothing would be left. He misunderstood what Evelyn had built inside her daughter, not immunity from hardship, but the ability to begin again. Rachel no longer measured justice only by what returned. She measured it by what stopped being taken, by the women who received help sooner, by the children who slept behind locked doors, by the forms that became bridges, and by kindness that lived long enough to become family. On the anniversary of Evelyn's death, Rachel and Grace visited the old neighborhood. The row house had been painted pale green. A bicycle leaned against the railing Jonathan had once installed. Curtains moved behind the front window. A little girl sat on the steps reading a book. Grace stopped at the sidewalk. "Do you think the house told them?" Rachel watched the child turn a page. "Yes," she said. "What did it say?" Rachel looked at the windows where her mother had once placed lamps against the winter darkness. She thought of soup simmering on the stove, blue dresses, library books. A Bible opened beneath tired hands. She thought of everything that had been lost, and everything that had refused to disappear. "I think it told them to keep books in every room." Grace smiled. "And what else?" Rachel took her daughter's hand. "To open the door when someone needs a place to stand." They continued down the street together. The afternoon sun stretched their shadows across the pavement. One tall, one nearly as tall now, and somewhere beyond sight, carried in memory, a third walking beside them. Rachel Monroe once believed she had fallen from the highest floor of a glass tower into a plastic chair beneath fluorescent lights. Years later, she understood that the chair had not been the end of her descent. It had been the ground beneath her feet, the place from which she rose, and the woman behind desk 7 had not rescued her. Eleanor had simply looked across a room filled with forms, recognized the name of someone who had once mattered, and refused to let hardship make that person invisible. That was the miracle. Not sudden wealth, not perfect justice. Not a stranger arriving with unlimited power. Recognition. Memory. A telephone lifted from its cradle. A door opened by one ordinary person for another. Sometimes that is how a life changes. Quietly. Across a government desk, while a little girl draws 3 women beneath a tree and gives wings to the one who is gone. While a tired mother discovers that dignity can survive an empty wallet. While kindness, planted years earlier without expectation, finally returns home.